Hello, dear friends. We're sincerely happy to greet you again. Today we will talk with the esteemed Igor Mikhailovich Danilov.
Greetings.
Igor Mikhailovich, many thanks to you for the previous conversation because, indeed, there were so many reminders in it of what sometimes gets erased in the routine of some daily affairs. While working on oneself, it is actually very important to update these internal guidelines in order not to leave the path, not to go off the route, and not to pursue false goals that are skillfully set by the demon so that a person doesn't gain life, and so as to shoot down the angel, as you said, already at takeoff. So I would like to begin today's conversation with a question that definitely concerns both one's work on oneself and such a topic as the dominant image in a person's consciousness. I'd like to quote a letter that we received. I'm kindly asking you to explain how to replace the dominant image. In one of the videos, Igor Mikhailovich suggested that we imagine a pink elephant with a golden bracelet on its trunk and let it go for a walk so that this elephant could run around as long as a person wants. So I've caught myself at the fact that I cannot really hold this image even for a second. While I'm starting to imagine a golden bracelet, the elephant disappears, not to mention it going for a walk anywhere. During practices, it is also extremely difficult for me to imagine something. As far as I understand, this means I have a certain dominant image. I would really like to replace it with the dominant image of spiritual salvation. Tell me, please, is it possible to do that? And if it is possible, then how? Are there any additional techniques that would help in this matter?
Of course, there are. Humanity has existed for a long time, and throughout the time of its existence, people have always been concerned with their spiritual salvation, with gaining life eternal. Certainly, many various practices and techniques have been developed. Also, techniques, practices, and knowledge were brought here by people whom the Lord Himself sent here, those whom we call the prophets. Naturally, a lot of various techniques have been developed, but their essence has always boiled down to one thing. And what is the difference? When a person imagines something, he, like an artist, draws images in his mind. Of course, while you're drawing, a bracelet on the trunk of an elephant, you don't see the elephant. When you're drawing an elephant, your bracelet disappears. And that's the point. You shouldn't imagine, in our usual understanding, but should see. In other words, a human as personality should tell his consciousness what he wants, and consciousness should generate a picture for him. Thus, a human should be in a dominant position as personality over his own consciousness. And that's it. So simple. But to achieve this simplicity, you have to do a lot of work. Many things must be done for consciousness to begin to obey you. Not you should obey it, but it should obey you. And here, a lot of various questions arise. Well, let's start with the point.
How to acquire this skill, let's say, yes.
Of course, definitely. If we remove all this religious, superficial sham, simple, clear, and understandable techniques will be left. Let's begin with that very autogenic training. After all, it gives a lot. And here, you work not based on imagination, but based on a desire to get what you need. The difference is huge. In other words, you want to see something, and you will see it. When you merely say to consciousness, "Show me," and consciousness must obey you. How to develop this skill? It seems to be a simple question, isn't it? Well, I have desired, and I have imagined. Okay, go ahead. Form a desire and imagine. And again, as soon as we start drawing something in fragments, we lose the whole picture. However, when you as personality are in a dominant position, you can zoom in on any fragment of the elephant and examine in detail. That very bracelet on its trunk without losing the elephant. If you want, the elephant will be walking all day long on the edge of a forest or, I don't know, in some woods or wherever you want, even in the center of a city. It doesn't matter. In a megalopolis, walking among people, and you will see it. But to do this, you should train your consciousness to be obedient. This implies autogenic training and meditative practices. All this has been told and described. It's just that you shouldn't desire what you don't need. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say I bought a fiddlestick. and I take care of it. Keep it safe and hold it in my hands for 3 hours a day. Tell me, if I don't know how to play the violin, and I don't even have a violin, why do I need this fiddlestick? A simple question. It seems to be out of subject. Now, let's look at it from a different perspective. After all, many of us use various techniques, including meditative ones, and various methods that we don't really need. I mean, first of all, a person should decide what he wants and why he needs one or another technique. After all, everything is very simple. There are two paths, as Bodhidharma said in his time. There's a simple path of attaining life eternal, and there's a path of service. That's all. If we really embark on the spiritual path, there is no third way. Although, if we take what Gautama said, he gave 3 paths. This is really true. In other words, there are 3 stages, or 3 steps. The first was to attain peace, and he considered this to be extremely important. Indeed, I agree with him. If a person attains peace, then after the death of his physical body, even after becoming a subpersonality, he does not do harm either to his near and dear ones, or to his friends who suffer from restless subpersonalities in the first place. This doesn't bring suffering to the person himself either. It means that the person perceives the state of subpersonality as a dream. He simply switches off and ceases to exist. And that is also a great reward. There are no torments or suffering, no thousands of years in a sleepless state, spent in detailed rethinking of one's whole life, which has been lived aimlessly. Yes, it seems to us that we have many goals in our lives and many things to do. But the point is that we miss the main thing. A human being is in this world not in order to propagate, to build a house, and to adapt to life. That goes without saying. A human being is in this world in order to gain life eternal. That's the point. Whereas Gautama believed that the first thing a human should attain is peace. The second stage is to gain life. And the third stage, for those who really come to know God's love, is already service. That is, a human should become a bodhisattva, since he can reach the state of bodhisattva, the state of supreme service to the spiritual world during his lifetime. Then he must do it. Well, it is easy to reason from Gautama's position when you have discovered an understanding of this world and its entire complexity. But it's another thing when you were born in an ordinary family. Regardless of whether your family members were believers or atheists, that's what we call lay people, meaning you have an ordinary, secular life. So you start from this position because you feel that you want to live. You want God's love, because you understand the entire doom and futility of this existence, and worst of all, its finiteness. You realize and understand that you as personality cannot die, that there is something greater beyond the death of your physical body. You feel this. So then a question arises for you. What's next? What is afterwards? And having realized that afterwards exists, a person starts to look for ways to gain life after death. And here, a lot of questions arise, especially at the initial stages of development. We have a lot of religions. It is clear that if a person delves into a religion and studies it, he will find those grains in any religion that will lead him to life eternal. But again, if a person is in everyday worldly life and he is preoccupied with a lot of various affairs, does he actually have time just to study even his religion? He does what he is told, and that's all. He is not interested in what is beyond, or he is forbidden to do so. That often happens too. Priests of many religions simply forbid a person to study something or to go deeper. They say, "You won't understand. You will make mistakes. We will teach you. We will tell you." Tell me, if this priest himself is nothing but a dead being, an inevitably dead one, how can he give you life if he himself doesn't have it? That's the answer. And the person begins to feel this. This leads to an inner dissonance in the person. On the one hand, he feels that he is obliged to gain life, but his consciousness tells him, "Where will you find it?" And at this point, the person starts searching. Of course, he encounters various techniques. The Oriental trend or the Western one, it doesn't matter which water he enters. The main point is that he understands that it is water, and this water is able to give him life. So he comes across a lot of different practices. And then curious situations begin. A person spends time, he spends his own life, on learning something that he simply doesn't need. Like my fiddlestick, which I talked about. I'll never play the violin. I don't know how to play it. So what do I need this fiddlestick for? The same applies to many people who will never embark on the path of service, but they want to gain life, to attain God's love. Why would they need complex practices that are necessary for those who have taken the path of a bodhisattva, who have embarked on the path of serving the spiritual world in this world? It's the choice of that person. In this case, complex, sometimes very complex practices are needed, and they really give a person certain powers. However, far and wide, our consciousness pushes us to engage in these complex practices. Why? Because in the depths of our consciousness, we understand perfectly well that these specific practices reveal non-standard capabilities, not like everyone else's. They give power. And after gaining this power, very often people forget about why they begin to perform those practices, and they already start using this power for manipulating people. In other words, in the beginning, a person embarks on the spiritual path and even takes the path of service, but eventually he takes the side of the devil and begins to use these acquired powers and these capabilities, not quite ordinary ones, not like other people have, in order to build a business or to gain some authority over people. Is this the right thing to do? Of course not. Because if a person uses powers that should be used for spiritual growth and for serving the spiritual world, but he begins to use them for his personal, selfish purposes, he will be punished quite severely. He creates additional problems for himself in the future. But does this actually bother us while we are here and consider ourselves alive? Of course not. We take pleasure here in having more capabilities than others do. We enjoy the fact that we begin to understand people. And consciousness tells us that people are too primitive. They are, pardon the expression, stupid as sheep. It's enough to just brainwash them, and they do what the one who deceives them wants. After all, we are constantly under manipulation by such people. Isn't that true? It is. And many of them started with the spiritual path. Only a few of such people actually deliberately went to study those manipulative technologies in order to become who they are now, consciously and with understanding, while many started with good desires, with wonderful aspirations, and they eventually discovered in themselves certain abilities of at least that very inner vision and understanding of how our consciousness is arranged, understanding of how this world is arranged, and how simple it is to manipulate and control the consciousness of other people. At that point, a person showed weakness before Satan's temptations and lost the path he had embarked on. So, as you can see, the tools are quite dangerous too. The simplest and the most reliable path is the path to the spiritual world in order to gain life. It is simple. It is enough to resist evil inside, to understand how your consciousness works, to stop being selfish, and not to carry a burden inside oneself. I mean envy, hatred, anger, or grudges against someone. A person should simply get rid of them. And that's it. You should forget and forgive everyone, all the things that burdened you in even the slightest way. You should start loving God, generating God's love inside. Then God will love you too. And after you have felt God's love, you should never part with it. This is precisely the simplest path, which doesn't hinder you, either from starting a family or from working. Nothing hinders you. A person only gets help from the spiritual world in love, joy, and gaining life. And this really means a lot. It is much better than peace. This is indeed true. Therefore, if we compare what Gautama said and what Bodhidharma added here, there is a big difference. Basically, their explanations are very similar. Why? Because the essence is the same. However, Bodhidharma immediately divided the world into two categories. I mean, the spiritual path. The first path is for lay people who should gain life, and the second one is the path of service. In other words, the path of a bodhisattva. Everything is very simple. Bodhidharma understood perfectly all the complexities of this world, and he knew people really well. So what he gave was simple and clear. And he also indeed understood that every human being aspires to become a champion. In fact, in each of us, our demon, first and foremost, pushes us to rise above the crowd by any means possible. This is what the demon skillfully uses in each of us. He generates this desire, and with this very tool, he sometimes shoots down even angels at their takeoff by means of temptation, a simple, trivial temptation. He forces many people to make the wrong choice. Indeed, if a person, say, a simple, ordinary person, like you and us, is busy with work, he has a family, and lots of issues and problems, no one actually prevents him from gaining life eternal. No one and nothing. Only consciousness that weakens him or leads him along the wrong path. After all, as we have already said, it's enough to gain God's love and never part with it. It's enough to be faithful to God and never betray Him. It's enough to understand and love people. Then you will have neither evil nor hatred or envy towards them, because you realize that whatever a person, the other person, gains in this world, it is temporary. Likewise, whatever you gain in this world, except life eternal and God's love, it's all temporary. When a person understands and knows this simple truth, he can easily reach the heavenly gate, and not only reach, but enter it. During his lifetime, a human can gain life. However, when a person chooses something greater, because he has an aspiration to become the best, to become a champion, then he embarks on the path of service. But in this case, there are a lot of nuances, a lot of practices, plenty of work, and there is a huge responsibility. In addition, this path, as we said, is quite precarious. Yet, it is interesting for us to try one practice, then another one, to find at least something somewhere that would give us some kind of power. You know, our consciousness always seeks confirmation. Our consciousness always needs some material facts or proofs. So surely, the practices that are used by those who embark on the path of service give such factual confirmations. Why? Because a person gains a slightly different perception of this world, a different understanding of it. But these practices are merely tools, while we are those who use them. And that's where the entire danger is hidden. You know, no matter how much we strive to become champions, we should always remember one thing, that in this world for every Vijay, there is a Raja. I'll give you a simple example. Perhaps it'll give you an understanding. For instance, back in his time, Bodhidharma came to China. He came to Shaolin Monastery. He gave people Qigong. He gave them knowledge. The first thing he started using was physical exercises, proper gymnastics, and breathing techniques. But apart from all health-improving things and necessary physical loads that he introduced for the discipline of the mind, first of all, when our body is loaded, when primary and secondary consciousnesses are focused, a human being as personality gets more freedom. This path, through physical exertion and concentration, is the quickest and the easiest. But when he came to the Shaolin Monastery, Bodhidharma wanted people who were there to follow not the path of a layman. After all, they were monks, and in his opinion, they were supposed to embark on the path of a bodhisattva. That's why there was such requirements for them. In addition, let's say, to physical training, naturally, he introduced martial arts. In other words, he started to teach those monks how to defend themselves, how to resist evil and armed criminals with their bare hands. Why? Because he believed that monks had to not only make their world safe, but also had to be responsible for those who lived near the monastery. So, there had to be peace and order. While at that time there were wars, the attackers were armed. So in Bodhidharma's opinion, the monks were not just supposed to use weapons perfectly, but also be able to resist, let's say, an armed criminal with their bare hands. That's why he introduced certain training techniques. This is how Wushu emerged, not only Qigong, but also the famous so-called Shaolin Kung Fu. Interestingly enough, literally, in the year 500, Bodhidharma set up a competition, the famous Bodhidharma competitions. The best of the best fighters took part in these competitions. Of course, Bodhidharma won the first competition, and 5 years later, he held the second competition. This is the way it has continued to this day. Every 5 years, there was, and still is, a competition between masters, real masters of hand-to-hand combat. Not only monks from Shaolin and other monasteries participate there, but clan schools also send their representatives and hold these competitions among themselves. According to Bodhidharma, competitions are good because they make people more conscientious and serious about their physical training. That's the reason why Bodhidharma introduced this competition. So, in the year 505, Bodhidharma also took part in the competition and won, of course. People were outraged then. It's understandable that when Bodhidharma won the first time and then the second time, they thought it was unfair. So, Bodhidharma established a rule that if a person wins twice in these competitions, he has no right to take part in any more competitions. It has been like that ever since. And the most remarkable thing is that after Bodhidharma, there have been only 2 people in 1500 years who managed to repeat what he did by winning these competitions twice. So what's my point? It seems that martial arts masters actually hold competitions where there are no rules. There's one rule. Whoever comes out should win. And that's it. Just like in life, if you're facing a criminal, you don't negotiate with him about rules and everything else. The strongest survives. Meaning, everything is for real. And the remarkable thing is that these competitions don't last rounds or minutes. As a rule, they are over literally within seconds. Why? Because it is masters who are facing off, and they seem to be the best masters in the world. But now, let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. Let's say, if those champions who win the competition established by Bodhidharma come out, for example, in MMA or boxing, what would happen? I'll tell you. They would lose almost instantly. Why? Because they wouldn't know what to do. It's funny, but it's true. They seem to be masters of such a high level. A person has devoted his whole life to martial arts. How can he lose in MMA? Easily, because he would go out there and feel absolutely restrained. Why? There are rules and restrictions there. That's the answer. Another example is a world boxing champion. For instance, in the previous video, we mentioned Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali. Could any of them win the competition established by Bodhidharma? I will answer, no. They would lose in the first second. Why? Because they have nothing to counter these masters. So you see how everything is relative in this world. There are certain rules, and those rules create limitations or give advantages. Everything is very simple. The same is here. In our daily life, just like in those very sports and on the spiritual path, if we choose to serve, we must adhere to certain rules. We must, first of all, curb our consciousness. And it's not consciousness that should control us, but we should control it. Without studying the work and the entire, I would say, meanness of our consciousness, we won't be able to achieve what we want. Why? Because it will deceive us. After the very first moments, when we receive at least some additional power, our consciousness will force us to use this power against people. If we do not control this demon inside ourselves. This is indeed so. A lot of people went through that, but a lot of people were also able to resist it. It is really true. Again, we started talking about Bodhidharma. He actually gave two paths, a path for lay people capable of gaining life, and a path of Bodhisattva. In fact, a lot of people after him succeeded in achieving it within a short period of time. Later on, of course, over time, everything was transformed and changed. Why? Because the records of Bodhidharma's words and the teaching he had left, most of it were burned when the Shaolin Monastery was conquered. It was burned down, and the library really burned up. A lot of information was later restored from memory by the monks who survived, and much was missed. Again, traditional Buddhism slightly opposed what Bodhidharma was talking about. Why? Because he renewed it. Or to put it more correctly, reset it. He removed everything added by people and restored the purity of that very Buddhism the way it was in Gautama's time. The only thing is that Bodhidharma shortened it and simplified the understanding. That's all. Certainly, what was inconvenient to others? Well, I'll give a simple example for you to understand. Again, those very Buddhists, in one of the trends, or rather branches of such a trend as the yellow hats, spent their whole lives undergoing purification with fire. For your understanding, there was such a practice as walking 50 steps on hot coals every evening. If you poorly work on yourself and your consciousness during the day, if you do not prepare for taking those 50 steps on the coals, you will definitely burn your feet. That required incredible efforts, a depth of concentration, and an understanding of everything. And then, yes, a person's body started working the way he wanted. Why? Because that's how we are designed. Where we invest our attention, especially if we invest it in a very focused way, that's what actually happens. And those people could really take 50 steps on the coals. Some people might say, I've walked on coals too, it's not that hard. You know, it is one thing to take 10 steps, but try to take 50. That's where you need a special state. And its essence boils down to the fact that our body starts to release more moisture from our souls. Nothing more. But as soon as we lose our concentration, then, excuse me, our body stops releasing that moisture. Meanwhile, it's a protective layer that allows us to walk those 50 steps. So what will happen if our souls are dry while walking on hot coals? It's one thing when there's a slight contact for just a few steps. It's not so bad. But when it is longer, people get burned. So tell me, is there any point in living for the sake of simply walking on coals? Meanwhile, people believed that this way they were purifying themselves. The question is, from what? It is the same question, as in the beginning, when we were asked the question that, even in practices and meditations, a person cannot imagine something, but what is one supposed to imagine in practices? I have a counter question. After all, practice is life. Whereas if we imagine something, we knowingly delude ourselves. Isn't that so? Even the work in more complex practices, which aren't really needed by most people, but only by those who embark on the path of service. For example, that very Chitveric, right? A lot of people know about it. Well, it's a special purpose practice. Yes, you can master it to understand what it is, to get at least an initial skill and confirmation that the world is a little bit different. Not the way we have known it since childhood. For this purpose, you can do it. Whereas to delve into this practice, if you are not going to serve, is like buying a fiddlestick alone. This is really so. Will it really be useful for you in your daily life? And there's a point here. It will be useful for you if you shift towards the manipulative side, if you give in to your demon. But this practice has nothing to do with gaining God's love and life eternal. Why? Because it's a working practice. And in fact, it is only necessary for those who embark on the path of service. You see how simple everything is. Yet we spend a lot of time trying to prove something to ourselves, to gain some skills. And we gain these skills not to reach God's world, but to assert ourselves in this earthly world. Well, these are temptations, and this point is extremely important. For instance, I'll give you just a simple example. In our daily life, some thought slips through, and we become upset. We get distracted. It's an instant. But this instant breaks the chain that makes up our entire life. That chain by which we tie the devil within us, that demon who tries to manipulate us. We've merely succumbed to temptation. We have forgotten about God's love. We have been distracted by earthly things. Or we have used our inner power to solve earthly problems. And the devil is set free. And then we'll have to weave a new chain from every instant of our life to restrain that very Satan. You see how simple everything is. Discipline, aspiration, and elementary skills. All this combined is what actually brings one to victory. It doesn't matter how many people and whom you defeat in this world. If you do not defeat your own demon, you will lose. That is why the victory over oneself is much more important. For only victory over oneself is what gives life. Life eternal. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, friends. Peace be with you and God's love.